Hey everyone, it's your girl Maddie here, aka Beavermosh, and today I am joined by Cody of Afterbirth, whose band just put out "In But Not of off of Willowtip Records. Cody, thanks for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Just hanging out, drinking some midday coffee.
Hell yeah.
My little babies, they just went up for their nap, uh, which is usually when this old man takes a nap too. But it's really if I don't do anything when they take a nap, then I don't get a chance to do anything at all. So I have to like sort of like seize the opportunity. It's like take a nap or stay awake while they're asleep and like do stuff. So um, I'm happy to be awake, not napping and speaking to you.
Ah,
Um, yeah.
well, I'm glad. How do you prepare your coffee?
I have a French press,
Hell yeah.
and I usually grind up the beans myself, but my grinder just broke, so
Oh,
I've been getting it pre ground, which is fine. A little
yeah.
bit less work for me, a little bit less noisy in the morning, and let it brew for like 10 minutes or so. Then I have this cool thermos that keeps it hot for like hours, and I like flavored creamer. Um, so even though I like super strong dark coffee, I'm a little bit basic in the fact that I want some sweetness with my bitterness. So it's like I don't know.
So I work in coffee professionally, and people
Okay.
think, "Are you like a coffee snob?" Like, no, I don't care with how people enjoy their coffee. It's just how I
Yeah,
make a living. But
sure. Well, that's awesome, and I'd be happy to listen to you talk about coffee too, instead of
yeah.
me talking about my band. Whatever.
Well, now this is about you. And first off, I just want to talk about the reception in Banana has received already. I think it's great, and it's getting pretty widespread acclaim from metal fans. What does that feel like? How glad are you to see that, and were you expecting it?
Um, so I have noticed like a wider reception,
Hmm.
more people discussing, acknowledging, hearing of, reading about it, whatever, much more widespread than our previous two albums.
Hmm.
So I didn't know what to expect, honestly, when the album was going to come out. I just sort of thought, well, it'll just be like our third album, and definitely it will get reviewed. Some people will talk about it, some people will like it, just like the last two. And I was like, I'm cool with that. Like we'll get some acknowledgement, some recognition. People will say this is cool. A few people will probably say this is too weird, and like the outliers will say this sucks.
Yeah.
But I wasn't quite expecting as many people, zines, websites, other labels, other well-known bands to just like notice it and prop it up.
Yeah.
And so it's been really it's been like special, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's been real extraordinary. So I'm riding that like dopamine high, and knowing that that's not real. I and preparing myself for like the crash, when the dopamine stops coming in, because like another amazing album by another amazing band will sort of like become a little bit more talked about, and that's fine because everyone has their moment. But anyway, like I'm really enjoying it. I'm quite pleased. And I wasn't expecting it. So I'm just trying to be open to it and take it all in and be like, people are into it, Cody, so let them be into it. And
Yeah.
not I don't really like the word pride, but I'm very like grateful for the reception. And I'm
Sure.
also um I'm pleased with all the hard work that me and the other band members did to make this happen. Like it was very challenging record to make. It was, over a long period of time writing all these songs, not knowing how they were going to come together because they were like very, very different songs. I'm like, I have no idea. It's like stressful even. I'm like, do these songs even belong together? Will they even go on the same album? Will this song be like for album 4 or 5 down the road? We're just like, no, just throw it all in the pot and hope for the best. So that, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with what you said about how people will talk about a record and hype it and kind of move on to the next one because that's just the
Yeah.
nature of music releases. We live on a week to week kind of thing every
Yeah.
Friday.
Yeah.
However, I think it may be advantageous for you that you did put out this record in the fall
Yeah.
because we're not that far off from list season. So you might see a bit of a drop down of the conversation, but I think it's gonna pick right back up for you because people are gonna be putting out their list. People like
Mhm.
me are gonna talk about the record again as
Sure.
much with other favorites from the year. So that might be a thing for you.
I think you're right, Maddie, and that's something I'm like looking forward to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, because even though it hasn't like died down a lot, I was thinking the very same thought. Like it'll probably pick up in like maybe a month or so. Like I'll hear, excuse me, even more, people talking about it, and that's cool. It'll get like
Yeah.
another bump.
Yeah.
So that's a cool thing. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk a bit about the history of your band because it's interesting.
Yeah.
You started out in the mid '90s and just put out basically just this demo, and then were inactive for almost 2 decades. What brought you all back together and deciding to make music again?
Yeah. Um, this is a good question, and it's a question people usually ask me.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, it's kind of a weird story. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. Um, but like to get, to your question, like what brought us together again, to start making more music. Um, in around 2013, I was living in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I had moved in a couple of different locations in the States and just like finding my way and stuff. And I had not thought about Afterbirth like at all, in like years and years and years. If I ever thought about it, it was just like I shrugged it off. If someone mentioned it, I was like, yeah, that was the thing I did when I was like a teenager, like whatever. And I wasn't even really playing guitar at that time, except for just sort of like noodling around and playing, making more like ambient stuff, noise stuff, not in a band stuff, just
Mm-hmm.
in a room making sounds, which probably annoyed most people I lived with, over years. But then in 2013, I was approached by John Dwyer. He owns a record label called Pathos Productions,
Mm-hmm.
who I hadn't heard of. I didn't really know. I just knew who he was because he had booked us on a festival many, many years ago in like 94, I believe. Or maybe it was 93. And it's probably like one of our first shows. And he had, anyway, gone on to still continue to promote music and put it out on his label, Pathos. He just casually approached me like, oh, I wanted to put out your demos and some live stuff. What do you think? And I thought, okay, that's cool. I don't mind. I haven't thought about Afterbirth in a while, so it's cool if you want to, but let me just talk to the other guys first.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't talked to in at least a decade. Primarily Matt, the vocalist, and Keith, the drummer, I had no contact with. But I felt it would be proper to get their permission, if that makes any sense, because I always
Yeah.
felt it was like all our band. It wasn't just my band. So I reached out to them and I said, this is the offer. What do you think? And we started talking. And then one thing led to another. And like, well, what if we just like got together and jammed again? Now, reminding you that I didn't even live in New York at the time. So like it wasn't really possible. Keith lived in Florida, like we all lived in different places. But I said, well, I'm going to come visit, in a couple months. I had like a wedding or something to go to for a friend. So I'm like, I'm going to be in New York anyway. My schedule will be pretty open. Um, so let me just, come there and jam. Actually, it wasn't the summer. It was the winter. It was January. But anyway, I was going to be there for some other event. And we just jammed and it felt pretty cool. It didn't feel like it was like, oh, this is it. This is totally serious. It was just like, I'm here, you're here, let's just play.
Yeah.
And but it was fun and it got like the gears turning both in my mind and their mind, also in like my heart a little bit. Like, is this like a passion of mine, of ours? Like, should we like really pursue it? Should we continue it? The jam session went well. I went home. We continued to discuss things. I'm like, well, I'm coming back again in the summer, so let's jam again. Like, let's just keep that going. And then it was sort of around that time after the summer jam, where I was there for like a week or two. We basically played like every night. I was on
Mhm.
vacation essentially. I didn't have a job. I didn't have anything to go to. So I was just like, I'll be at the studio all day. Just come play. Um, and it felt good. So we're like, let's just see if we can get this going again. Still not thinking like really far into the future. Like let's just keep playing. And then I thought, well, maybe I should move back home, or back to New York, not home,
Yeah.
and take it from there, because I wasn't really super happy in Texas. It was just like an experiment in
Mhm.
living, in existing. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I was there for a few years and I'm like, I'm happy with what I've done here. I don't feel really rooted here. I don't feel like I need to stay here and accomplish anything else. Like whatever I was going to do here, I did. So I'll just move back. And that's what happened. And then we jammed much more seriously, more frequently.
And so you're all in New York now?
Yep. hmm
Cool.
Yep. So I moved back. It was um early 2014. So almost 10 years ago now.
Cool.
Dave, who is my best friend, I've known him forever, was already here. Matt, who was the vocalist at the time, he was here already. And then we were just waiting for Keith, the drummer, who was moving up from Florida. And I think that happened within a month or two of me moving back. He moved back up here. So then we were all together again.
And then when you got back together and you started jamming again, was it immediately the intention to start recording again, or was it just like, let's play some shows, or just jam out together, or what?
It was like all of those things. It's like, let's
Yeah.
write some more songs. Let's see if we can like play a show or two. And then let's record another demo. So we had pretty much all of those intentions from the jump at that point. And we did. We recorded a demo a few months after that. I can't remember the timeline exactly, but like it was like 2024, 2014 rather, winter, beginning of the year. And then I think that spring or summer we recorded a 4-song demo that was just called the 2014 demo. In May of that year, we played a show in New Jersey,
Mhm.
and we were still busily writing other material that became part of the first album. It wasn't recorded as a demo. So we had those 4 songs recorded as a demo. We still had rough material in the works. We played one show, and there were some sites set ahead to the future. We didn't know what the future was, but like let's just keep doing what we're doing. Yeah.
At this time, considering that you had only done a demo previously, did it feel like you were a new band, or did you feel like veterans coming back together? Like that's kind of like an interesting kind of position you would have been in at the time.
Yeah, it felt good to jam again.
Yeah.
It felt like new, it felt fresh. We had new ideas, like
Mhm.
sort of like coming out already, even at that time, um, because everyone had kept busy, like
Mhm.
musically speaking, even though I was not in a band necessarily. I had always made music, again, more ambient noise stuff, which is music to me, but more importantly, it was still a creative outlet for me, utilizing the guitar as a primary source of sound. Dave was in multiple bands the entire time. He had joined Helmet, a few years before that. So,
Mhm.
you know, he's actually on tour right now. So Helmet's been like his big main gig in addition to Afterbirth. Keith, the drummer, was jamming with some people. I don't really remember if they were any serious, you know, outings with that, but he was still playing and writing music. And Matt, I think, had kept busy to some extent. So it felt it felt fresh. It felt good. We were bringing other ideas to the table because of our activity outside of the band for so long.
Yeah, and it sounds like this iteration of the band is considerably different than that early demo. Was this
Yeah.
in this time that you were away, this 2-decade period? Would you say that all of you evolved a lot as musicians?
I mean, I think I can't say no, we didn't evolve. It's like obvious that we evolved, but I
Hmm.
didn't realize it at the time.
Sure.
Like always, just referencing myself, speaking about myself, I always thought well, I still played guitar and I still did interesting things, but I didn't know if I got better or not. Um, but I did realize I am playing some different stuff, whether it's
Yeah.
better or not. I have evolved. So the answer about evolution was, for me, a resounding yes. And obviously the other guys did. Like Dave, the bass player, and Keith, the drummer, like those guys are like world-class musicians. Those guys are
Mm.
way better than I'll ever be. They can like literally play and jam anything. They could play like any style of music and like at the drop of a hat, like no problem. Keith's a multi-instrumentalist. He plays drums, he plays piano, plays keyboard, he plays a little guitar. He doesn't have a bad singing voice, so
Yeah.
and same thing with Dave. Dave can sing, Dave can play bass. He used to play a little guitar. He doesn't really play guitar so much anymore. Um, so they evolved as
Mm.
multi-instrumentalists, and also being around other musicians a lot. So a lot more was brought to the table. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly.
No,
But,
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, I don't want to stick on kind of this, talking about this gap forever, but I do want to ask you one last thing is that like
Yeah.
during this time you said you were doing ambient music, and it's not unheard of for metal musicians to dive into ambient. That has happened a few times. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, during this time, were your ears still in tune to what was going on in metal? Were you listening to metal? Was it something that was still influencing you?
Yeah, it was. I sort of like came in and out of metal a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, not in like a way that I denounced it. I just had times where I'm way more into like ambient. I'm just using the term ambient as like an umbrella term,
Sure.
different music, could be experimental, could be noise, could be what have you. Um, so I still always like listen to metal, death metal primarily. I'm mostly like a death metal person.
Sure.
Um, it was always there. Sometimes I would, like, oh, what's this big name band putting out now? Let me just go see what they're doing. Or I never heard of this band, but I think the logo looks sick, and someone told me that it was a good album that I should listen to. So sometimes it was just word of mouth. Sometimes it was just my own curiosity about death metal that like never left me, that kept me like rooted um, somewhat into death metal, even though I would say I wasn't like entrenched in the underground, maybe the way I was when I was in Afterbirth as a young man, for lack of a better term.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, I came in and out of it, but death metal was always there. It never really left me, and there were times it was just more prevalent than others.
Sure. Well, let's turn gears now to talk
Mhm.
about the current record. So this album is to my ears and to many ears, it's quite progressive. There's a lot of strange turns. There's even some jazzy influences, other elements coming in and out. It's not
Yeah,
predictable. And did you go into this thinking let's let's make death metal weird, or was it just kind of you started writing and this is what came out naturally?
yeah. So there was no real like intention to
Mm-hmm.
like make things really different or disparate or weird. It was like I would just say, okay, here's one song. Let's work on this song. This is particularly maybe more of a black metal influence in this song, at least to my ears, and
Mm-hmm.
this is how it came out. I have no intention to be a black metal band, but here's the song, and it sounds more like black metal to me. And then here's another song, which it has more of like it feels more grindcore to me, not only
Yeah.
because of the riffs, but because of like the brevity of the song. And then this one is more like technical slam death metal, So yeah, there was no intention ever to like make a certain sound or make a certain record. It was just everything that was coming out of me initially, because I write like the skeletal structure of each song and then I
Mm-hmm.
present it to the band, and then those guys do their thing to it. The basic structure of the song was different for each song I presented, and I have no way to explain how that came about. It just was.
Well, that's an interesting way of kind of crafting material. And I'm wondering then, uh, you say you present this kind of this framework, this base for the track. Did you get any back after hearing your bandmates playing with it and be like totally surprised? Like, I did not see this track going in this direction.
almost every song is like that. It
Yeah.
not even just on this album, but like every song that I write, you know, whether it's like fully fleshed out and presented or it's just like a couple of riffs, whatever like those guys throw back at me, I never expect. I never know what they're gonna do. You know, the thing, even the drums, though, like Keith does like a pretty good job of like keeping close to like what my original intention is. He'll still take it up to another level that I'm like, I just didn't even know you could do that, you know, like you're doing a blast beat, for instance, but then you're doing like these fills and like these accents, and I'm like, I didn't hear that, but you heard that, you know, so that's what you're putting on there, and it just totally works. And then Dave, the bass player, he like rarely doubles what I'm playing. He does something totally different most of the time, not in a jarring way. Like
Mm.
the bass and the guitar work together, even though like they're sort of like separate creatures or separate entities. It's not that you can't. You hear how they meld themselves together. It's not ever that I'm playing a riff and Dave is trying to do something really super technical over it when that's not what's called for. He's very good at being aware of like what the music calls for. He's like,
Yeah.
well, he'll say like, well, the music's already technical here. I'm going to do something much more simplified, you know, or the opposite. He's like, this is real simple, so I'm kind of going to go off a little bit and do something maybe a little bit more like not quite a bass solo, but you know, a little bit more of a noodly riff, you know, as an example.
And I always like hearing that. Like I get to, I mentioned it sometimes in my reviews when it happened, when it seems like the guitar and bass are in sync with each other, but they're almost counterpointing. They're almost going in different directions and like
Mm-hmm.
maybe even harmonizing or doing something different in that's not just we're playing the same line, I'm just playing it lower, you're playing it higher. It's
Yeah.
cool when bands figure out how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I rarely tell Dave like what to do. It's a little different with Keith because I have to. I'm like, there has got to be some structure. You know, I can't just be like, well, here's 5 minutes of guitar riffs. Do whatever you want. So that would be an interesting way to do it. I do like to keep things sort of like reined in a little bit, like give him like the basic idea of like what to do and where. But with Dave, I don't ever I don't ever say, oh, I hear or I could hear you doing this over or under the bass. I never do that with him. I'm just like, here's the riff and do whatever you want. He will come back to me with a riff or whatever he's doing, and he'll ask me if I like it or not. And there's plenty of times I'm like, maybe you should work on that a little bit more. Personally, maybe it sounds weird to my ears. Um, and other times, or most of the time, whatever he does, and he says, let me show you this, check this out." I'll be like, just keep doing that. Like whatever you're doing, just keep doing that. You know?
And so you're talking to me about how the like the music is crafted. Now there's also the lyrical component. Is
Yeah.
that you? Where is that coming in this process?
So I try not to really, also with Will, like step on or meddle too much. I don't want to say step on his toes, but I try not to meddle too much with him.
Mm.
Um, a couple of songs I do like write lyrics. I'll just say, here's some lyrics that just came to me. I'm not like a lyricist
Hmm.
necessarily, but sometimes I'll write lyrics and I'm like, here's some lyrics that I think might be cool. I'm not saying that you have to use them, but maybe you want to take them and use them in the song because I was thinking of this song when I
Yeah.
wrote the lyrics. So but he's got his own thing going on. He kind of like knows where to fit lyrics, how to sing lyrics over certain sections or stay out of certain sections.
Sure.
So yeah, he writes most of the lyrics himself. I don't try to mess with that. Um, I don't even really try to tell him where to sing.
Hmm.
Occasionally, I might say, oh, over this one part, I could hear like a shriek. Like, could you do a shriek there? Maybe if it
Yeah.
makes sense to you, and you have it in you, could you do it? But other than that, I won't be like, you have to sing on this riff, and then you have to stop at this break, and then you have to. I'm very like hands off with those guys, even though I write the songs essentially. I try not to tell those guys really how to manage their business, I guess,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
Now, your band, at least when I've seen you classified or talked about, you're generally described as a form of brutal death metal. Does that mean anything to you? Is that a term you wear proudly?
The word or the term brutal death metal doesn't mean anything to me.
Hmm.
Uh, not that I don't think it's cool. I mean, if people
Yeah.
want to call us brutal death metal, that's fine. Um, so this is something I was actually thinking about recently, and it does come to my mind every now and again because when I was young and I was just getting into death metal in the very early 90s, there weren't so many subgenres or categorizations of death
Sure.
metal. Like you could listen to a band and know that they were different. Like if I listened to Incantation, I would not mistake them for Cannibal Corpse, and I would not mistake Cannibal Corpse for Pestilence, and I would not mistake Pestilence for Oppressor. Like everyone was like very different. They had like their own language, their own musical language. Um, and it was all just death metal. Like you would,
Yeah.
and to me, it's interesting because the word or the term brutal, like I would say, if I liked something, I would be like, oh, dude, that's just brutal.
Hmm.
To me, everything was brutal, you know, but not brutal death metal. It was just brutal. Like if I listen to Gore Guts, I'm like, man, this shit is so brutal.
Yeah.
I listen to Atrocity. This shit is so brutal. It was almost like an overused term for me. Like I used the word brutal to describe everything. And then sort of after we disbanded early on, and then people started asking, "Oh, what happened to you guys?" You know, many years later, and then I still stayed listening to death metal. You noticed, or I noticed these like subgenres, like brutal death metal or slam death metal, and all this stuff. And I was like, where all this stuff come from? Like, no one was really using those terms as readily
Yeah.
when Afterbirth was first going. You know, I think probably what happened is someone said that we were brutal. Like I would describe any band as brutal, and then it just probably like stuck. Like we were brutal death metal. Same thing, probably like, and then you lumped Devourment into there or
Yeah.
Deeds of Flesh into there, and like these guys are brutal death metal. Defeated Sanity, brutal death metal. It is brutal, but I mean,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily feel like I have to parrot that. Like, okay, if you want to call us brutal death metal, that's fine. And I will be proud of that to an
Hmm.
extent, but I'm like, whatever, we just play death metal, really. We're
Yeah.
from
It's
Long Island. Yeah, that's it.
it's interesting how that kind of sound got classified as brutal, as if like other death metal isn't brutal, but brutal used now and used as a context. It's describing like a rhythmic approach, like a riffing style, and that's
Right.
interesting that gets kind of licensed as brutal. Now I know when people use the term, I know what they're talking about. I know that Suffocation is
There you have
brutal death
it.
metal, yeah, but
Yeah.
like I don't know. It's always interested me. I never really understood why it was called that, but I know and I kind of hear why people maybe describe your band as such. But
Mhm.
yeah, death metal subgenres are interesting. I know that Immolation isn't necessarily playing the same type of death metal as In Flames. No, it's very different, but
Right.
and classification in that way for who wants specific sound is good, but also yeah, you're right. It's death metal, you know.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting.
Now, your label. I've interviewed a handful of bands off of Willowtip now, and I've only heard good things. What has the experience with them been like?
It's been amazing. So I
Yeah.
think, so you earlier asked me like how I felt about like the album's reception and how there are a lot more people talking about it and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of that has to do with the label and Jason, Jason Tipton, he's the label head, the CEO, I guess. I don't know if that's his actual title, but um he it just seems like he stands like really firmly behind like every single band that
Hmm.
is involved with the label. And I mean, I would hope so. If you're signing a band and investing money and time and so much effort into a band, I would hope that you would back this band, whoever it
Yeah.
happens to be, till the very end, unless they're a bunch of fascist shitheads or something like that,
Yeah.
But I mean, other than that, like if you believed in the band enough to sign the band and like give them like, cash for recording, and you promise them X amount of money for whatever, and like you're making all this merch and all this stuff. Um, yeah, he's totally behind it. So it seems he's responsive like to my emails. He's responsive like to our ideas. It seems like he's 100% behind it. And, not to sort of turn this into like a negative conversation, but like our previous label, Unique Leader, didn't seem like that at all. And I have my reasons for knowing why that is, mainly in that Eric, who was in Deeds of Flesh, who started Unique Leader, passed away. Like right after our debut album came out, and the label sort of like changed hands and things like that. And I think the people running it now have a different vision, and a different sense of who on the roster is important and who isn't, so to speak. So that was like disappointing, to have that sort of experience. Would it have been different, had Eric, lived? I like to think so,
Sure.
but it's just not what happened, But yeah, Willowtip has been fantastic, and it's just been like a dream of mine to be on that label. So it's so weird to be me in a
Yeah.
sense. Like the history of the band, and like, listening to bands, for instance, on Willowtip like many years ago, and just having the sense that what this label is sick. Like everything they put out is like totally sick.
Yeah.
And like not knowing that in the future, like I would actually like be a band that's on that roster. So I'm like, the label and Jason must have a lot of faith, not only in what they do, but in the band, because I just think they don't put out subpar albums or material. Like you might not like every band on the label, but like you have to admit, I mean, or I'll admit, it's always like superior product. It's always like well-crafted music, even though, there's like a handful of bands where I'm like, I think they're cool, but I don't resonate with them as much.
Yeah.
But they definitely belong on Willowtip, and I'm glad that like we're label mates, so to speak.
Yeah. And when I think of Willowtip, they're one of the labels. You're right. Whenever I see, oh, this is coming on Willowtip, I'm going to listen. When I see it in my promo inbox, oh, it's Willowtip, definitely going to listen. It
Mm-hmm.
seems that Willowtip, you're right, doesn't put out just any metal record. If it's just like kind of an average thing, which is fine. If it's not going on Willowtip. Willowtip seems to want to put out music that may not be everyone's cup of tea, but at least pushing some type of boundary,
Yeah.
pushing some type of button, and I respect the hell out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I remember one of the years where, before Afterbirth got together, and I was still maybe more into the ambient stuff, but I was getting heavier into death metal. It was like 2009 or 2010. For me, it was just, I remember those years being, I was jumping back into metal a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Like a big album for me was Everything is Fire by Ulcerate. And that came out on Willowtip. And I was like, this is just like fucking incredible. Like how,
Yeah.
like, I'm like, who is this band? And I'm like, Willowtip? And I already knew the Willowtip label from other releases, but I'm like, it just got me interested again in death metal, like this band, Ulcerate in particular, And then it got me interested again in like Willowtip, So I just like revisited like all the bands I had missed out on. And I'm like, everything that they're putting out is like a hit. So to think back on those years, like 2009, 2010, and how heavily I was into this Ulcerate album and what Willowtip was doing, and just thinking, God, this is like incredible. And then to like, fast forward, 15 years or more, not quite 15 years, to
Yeah.
actually be on that label. Again, it's just like, it's wild. It's like a wild thing, not even in my wildest dreams could I have even thought that would happen, So it's pretty cool.
And All Star's an amazing band, and think about what They did, and yeah, I actually didn't realize they were on Willowtip off the top of my head, but or at least had put out records on Willowtip. But at the time when Ulster was doing that, like, I don't think this like disso death phenomenon was as like prominent as it is. But they really like kind of pushed that into motion. This more
Yeah.
like angular and kind of like
Hmm.
textured approach to death metal that I think a lot of people enjoy, and I enjoy, and like a lot of bands have sprouted because of that approach.
Yeah, like I hadn't heard too many bands doing stuff like that. Like you would have maybe riffs or sections in songs that bands did stuff like that.
Mhm.
They took that idea and like really ran with it, and it sort of resonated with me, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. Um, Obviously, like Gore Guts before them with Obscura,
Yeah.
and even From Wisdom to Hate, they were maybe the only other band where I could think that they were, doing stuff like that. And I know there was more. I
Mhm.
just I just can't remember who was doing what exactly at this time. But I mean, there were definitely bands that were using those techniques, and or like that approach, and I appreciated that. That's why I like really like blew my mind again, and like got me like back into like death metal like pretty heavily. Because even the disso death thing, whatever you want to call it, it's very like angular, it's very grating, it's
Yeah.
very intense. But to me, it's also like very like emotive, and it's very like colorful. It like really like takes me on a ride.
Mhm.
It's not a ride I always want to go on, but when the mood strikes, I'm like, there's nothing better, than that, to me. So it was an inspiration, not an inspiration in the fact that I wanted to copy it,
Yeah.
but an inspiration to like want to be good
Yeah.
on guitar, and or better on guitar, and like being a band that people also like respected at least. So, and here we are. Those weird, silent, nascent seeds were like germinating back then, but I didn't know it, which
Yeah.
is kind of cool.
And you're right. And when I think of like, death metal, and I love like the kind of straightforward this is death metal bands like Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, like that stuff is great. But I think a lot of bands over time just did that. That's what they played, and eventually bands like that, I think to my ears, even today, sounded stale, kind of like uninteresting to me. Like I've heard this, but then like bands like Ulstred or other bands doing similar things, like, oh, you're right. This is so much more. There's so many more mountains and hills to this. It's such a different
Hmm.
emotional journey, and I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So those bands like took death metal in another direction. And to some extent, like, death metal maybe did become, I don't know if stale is the right word, but like over
Sure.
time you become like desensitized
Yeah.
to certain
Good.
things. So it's like I wouldn't personally ever say, oh, Cannibal Corpse is like stale, or but I feel like I don't really need to listen to Cannibal Corpse that much anymore. When I'm in the
Mhm.
mood, it really does a lot for me. I actually just
Yeah.
went on like a Cannibal Corpse binge like a month ago.
I did
And
too.
some of like those early Corpse Grinder albums is what I was like mostly listening to, like Gallery of Suicide, Vile, and forgetting the other one. I was like spinning a lot, but I was like, God damn, like these are really good. Like Gallery of Suicide, like hit me hard in a good way. I was like, this album is fucking dope. This is
Yeah.
like, and I didn't really think about it like that at the time. Um, Not to go off on a tangent, but like, so Corpse Grinder joined Cannibal Corpse. Chris Barnes was out, and I'm like, okay, I'll give it a whirl. I didn't really like Vile. That was like his first album with them.
Hmm.
So then I just kind of stopped paying attention. But then Gallery was the one after that, and I'm like kicking myself for like not having been paying attention back then, because I'm like, this album's great, like I really like this one. But anyway, whatever.
I actually think Hill might be my favorite Cannibal Corpse record.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a pretty good one.
one of the Corpse Grinder records.
Mhm.
And I've had this exact conversation about Cannibal Corpse in multiple interviews, and I'm gonna have it again with you. But
Oh, okay.
I well, Cannibal Corpse is a band that I think a lot of people unfairly will say, oh, Cannibal Corpse was cool, but now they're just continue to put out the same record. And I'm like, I don't
Good.
care. I
Yeah,
don't
good.
care. I don't care at all because I I can hear a band who it's like they're making that decision because it's the music they want to play and it's still motivating them. They're not putting out the same record because it's focus group like, oh, let's not take any risk because this will sell. And then they're also like not putting something out weird because it doesn't feel right for them. They are putting out the music that is for them. And if they're a band that needs to put out a similar riffing style every album, then go for it because it's
Yeah.
working and I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see anything wrong with that. And if and I would say I'm like a fair weather Cannibal Corpse fan because of that, you know. But when the mood strikes and it pulls me back in, I'm like, I'm glad they're still doing what they're doing. I'm like, because when I want to listen to something like Cannibal Corpse, you almost like can't get better than Cannibal Corpse. So
No.
it's like I'm like glad that they're there. I'm glad they're still doing what they're doing. And like you'll like read or watch or listen to interviews with them. Like those guys are very down to earth. They're very passionate about what they do. They're just very human and they're good at what they do. And like, why would you stop? You know, like, so I'm glad that they're alive and I'm glad that they're happy and thriving in their band that's existed for 30 plus years. Like, what? How could anyone like shit on that? I'm like,
Yeah.
if a human being is happy, like, you know, uplift them, or at the very least, don't like, you know, don't like spit on it. Just be like, okay, you know, it maybe not for me, but like I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. So I'm never gonna like say Cannibal Corpse sucks and should throw in the towel. Like I won't say that about any band, even like the Rolling Stones who just like put out another album. I'm like, part of me is like, I can't believe this band is like still going on and they put out another album. I don't really care about them at all, but I'm like, the fact that musicians and music, like it really like I think it allows for like longer, happier lives.
Sure.
And so why would I have a problem with that? You know, like I don't care that the Rolling Stones put out another album necessarily, but I'm so happy that those guys, the original members that are still there and the session guys that are lucky to be involved with them are still making this their livelihood and they're still touring and they're doing
Yeah.
their thing and cool, good for them. I hope Cannibal Corpse is able to do this for a little while longer too, though I think there's more like physical rigor involved and I don't know if you'll be able to like play, you know, fucked with a knife when you're 72 years old. You know, like I think that's like an honest
Yeah.
way of looking at it. Like probably not. You know, I think the sad part is Cannibal Corpse and all death metal bands will there is a shelf life to it, much longer shelf life than anyone ever thought. But
Mhm.
there is a shelf life, you know. So these bands that we adore and love and we're influenced by, they will stop. But then there's younger bands that are coming up, and it remains to be seen whether Undeath is like the next Cannibal Corpse or whatever, or if you know Two Mold is like the next whatever band. And like I hope that they are, you know. Um, but you know, someone's going to take the reins. Absolutely.
I hear like, yeah, and the continuous rebirth of
Mm-hmm.
metal, I'm so grateful for it and so
Yeah.
passionate. I know you can go read like think pieces from the 90s that proclaimed that metal was like dead when like
Yeah.
grunge hit, and you look at that now, it's like that's so absurd. Why did people think that? It continues to like find new avenues, and there's new bands who are like inspired by the past legends who are taking that and putting it in new directions. And that continuously churns out new and exciting music. And I'm so
Mm-hmm.
happy to be a metal fan, and I don't think it's ending anytime, at least in the next. It's not ending in my lifetime, in my opinion.
Probably not. I think death metal will sort of like have like little hills and little valleys that it like peaks and goes into troughs of.
Yeah,
Um, I don't have any predictions, but you know, I definitely have a sense that at some point, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, metal might once again become less popular than it is. Like that's fine.
sure.
It's never going to go away. I mean, if anything, we've seen that death metal continues to thrive, um, especially when it goes back underground. You know, that's like a time for growth in a way that we won't see as it's in like a valley, but we'll see it later. You know, when death metal sort of like goes back underground, we won't really see the effects of that
Yeah.
until like a few years later when those seeds that are planted start sprouting. You know, or also there's children right now who might not be of age to like listen to or play listen to death metal or play instruments, but like maybe in a year or two they will start to become aware of it,
Yeah.
and then give those children another 5 to 7 years and they'll be in the bands that people are talking about, you know.
Yeah, and it's and you know, and you're right. It may say underground. I have a hard time like envisioning like another like album like Master of Reality or Ride the Lightning, you know, doing as well as is one of those like icons of the genre. But who knows, you know? But I still think like you're right. There are people that are going to hear. There are people hearing Metallica for the first time right now who are
Yeah,
like blown away, who are going to want to do something inspired by it, and you know that's exciting.
it's exciting to me. And you know, I know people are just like they roll their eyes and they think Metallica, who cares? And yeah, okay, maybe who cares all that much about like new Metallica material?
Mm-hmm.
But like the fact that Metallica is still in existence and like they're still playing and they did write albums that had such a huge impact on people, um, and people are still discovering it. Like again, like I'm so happy that Metallica continues to exist, even though like anything they've done in the last 10 years or so hasn't really like hit me the way it would have 20 years ago, and that's fine. But it's another vehicle for metal music to like move forward, or maybe not move forward in Metallica's case, but at least remain visible, like highly visible. So
I remember still, I was in high school the first time that I listened through and heard, you know, the Master of Puppets album and being completely blown away. Like, what is this? And I wish I can have that experience again, but I'm so glad that there are people that can still have that experience of hearing that record for the first time.
yeah, so a weird thing with Metallica, and this happens to me with some albums, and I don't need for someone to explain it to me. I don't need to know why this is, but
Yeah.
so I might go ahead and say like Injustice for All is probably like my favorite metal album ever. Like I have no
Okay.
problem saying that because it affected me so much at just like the right time, like just everything going on in my life. I was at the right age. Like I had just turned 13 and it was like one of the first metal tapes I bought on my own. So it felt like momentous to me. And like it felt like something that only older kids did, but now I was doing.
Yeah.
And like the way I listened to that album like incessantly and repeatedly in eighth grade and like the emotional roller coaster that I was going through as like I entered puberty, and that music was like always in my brain. When I listen to Injustice for All, and I still listen to it like regularly enough, like every couple of months I'll play it like once or twice through. Um, I still somehow I can feel the way I did when I first heard it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very weird. It's like all those pathways, they didn't become like calcified, they didn't become dead or moved off to some other part of my brain or taken up by other like chemicals from other albums. Like no, there's like synapses in my brain and my nervous system that like exist just for that album. They remain open and they're just waiting for me to listen to it again. And then all that good vibe, all those good vibe hormones and chemicals are like, holy shit, here we are again.
Mm.
This look, you know.
That's so fascinating to me. And that gives me goosebumps hearing that, like, the
Yeah.
way our brain is wired to react to music and how it sometimes can hit different synapses in different ways for different people, and how metal does that for some people, and how that specific record could continue to have that reaction for you. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's mysterious. It's part of like the mystery of music in general, like how music for me is like like an essential like life affirming activity. Um, and for it is for many others. And I would be willing to bet money that most people would have a similar experience with maybe not Metallica's and Justice for All, but they have an album where it's like, yes, almost every time I listen to this, like I'm back to where I was, not in like an infantilizing way. It's more like it just everything is like it was a crystallized moment in time, um, and it's there for like me to rediscover. I bet other people have something like that. Maybe it's a Black Sabbath album, maybe it's a Dio album, maybe it's a Mountain album, maybe it's a Carcass album. I don't really know what it could be that for someone else, another album.
Mm-hmm. Well, if it's okay for you, I want to ask a bit of more of a fun question because I like talking about it. I know you're from New York.
Yeah.
And people like to talk about the food in New York. I've heard the stereotype that New Yorkers love pizza and cheesecake. I don't know how true that is for you or how much of that is just a stereotype, but based on your taste, if I come visit Long Island, what are the places I got to hit?
Um, well, I'm not like a huge pizza guy.
Okay.
I think growing up on Long Island in New York, like pizza's prevalent everywhere, and I enjoyed pizza like far too much when I was younger. And then when I got older and I was like on my own and I didn't have a lot of money, I would often just eat pizza because it was cheap. So I've had my fill of pizza. So I'm almost like, I'm not really like a pizza guy. Like honestly, I'm more of like an Indian food guy, like a Thai food guy.
I love Thai food.
Yeah, which is funny because there's not where I'm on Long Island, there's not a lot of places around. Like I have to travel far if I want to eat food like that. And oftentimes I just don't have the time. So like I find myself going long stretches where I don't have Indian food or Thai food.
Yeah.
But it's delicious. Like that's my favorite food. It's weird, like a Long Islander saying that, but
I don't think so.
Yeah.
That's so interesting to hear that like Thai food is like less accessible for you.
Yeah.
I live in Minneapolis, which is a significantly smaller city than you,
Yeah.
but there's so much Thai food. And also something about Minneapolis, and not to talk about me too much, but it's a city that has a very large Vietnamese population. So
Yeah,
there
I'm
is
aware of that. Yeah.
a place to get Vietnamese food on every corner here in the city, and I feel very lucky about that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's amazing. Like,
Yeah.
it just happens to be where I live. So Long Island's an interesting place. Like, it's bigger than you think, but it's also, smaller than you think. But you need a car to go anywhere.
Okay.
There's not good mass transit out here, which obviously that sucks.
Yeah.
So you have to like drive anywhere worthwhile. And also, it takes a long time to get anywhere because there's a lot of traffic, and like it's almost like there's a stop sign or a traffic light everywhere. So it might take me like 15 minutes just to get to like a major highway, which isn't that far away from me. Literally like 2 miles down the road, but it takes me so long to get to the main conduit. And then once I'm on there, then I have to drive to an exit wherever, maybe 40 miles up the way or 20 miles or 5. Then I have to get off. And then I have to get on like another like major roadway, and there's like even more traffic. So it's almost like it's so defeating sometimes. I'm like, as hungry as I might be and as much as I want Indian food, I don't want to take an hour and a half out of my life to go get it and drive home and eat it, So yeah. But when I lived in I lived in Queens and Brooklyn for a while. I worked in Manhattan. This is when I was much younger. Like you could get almost any type of food anywhere. You could get like Ethiopian food, Vietnamese food, Polish, whatever. You could almost literally go anywhere at any time of the day and get it. One of the last times me and my wife went into Manhattan, which was too long ago now because we have kids, we don't do shit anymore. But I remember we were there for a couple of days, and we had gone to some museums and stuff, and we were hungry, and I was like, oh, I want Chinese food, and I don't just want any Chinese food. Like I want to go into Chinatown and just go into like a hole in the wall Chinese food, which I used to do a lot when I was living there. And dude, we literally found like the hole in the wall Chinese food place. And I just went in there and I'm like, yeah, give me some of that. And like my wife, she was just like, you're gonna eat that? I'm like, I'm absolutely gonna eat this. And it's absolutely going to be like the best Chinese food I ever tasted, probably. And it was pretty damn good. I miss having access to restaurants like that, whether it's
Yeah.
like hole in the wall type food or whatever. You know, there's not a lot of places like that here, unfortunately.
So I've been to New York City once, but I was a very young kid. I don't know why my parents dragged me there, but I so I don't know much about kind of other than what I've read about how the boroughs are kind of separate. But so you're describing that like Long Island seems to be built and set up a lot different than say Queens or Manhattan.
It is.
Yeah.
You know, you have like your main centers, you have like, you know, a town,
Hmm.
and, you know, it's usually set up in some sort of a grid. And
Yeah.
then, you know, coming out of that grid are like one or two major roads. So it's much like Queens or Brooklyn, but like Queens and Brooklyn is like less of a navigable grid. It's like sort of a confused grid. You
Yeah.
know, you like they made a grid of streets and roads, then they decided to build like a highway through it. So then they had to build like another grid of streets, and that sort of like is angled at it in a weird way, and it doesn't make sense. And they just kept doing that, you know. Long Island's not like that so much. Like you have like a suburban city center, I guess, and it's pretty easy to get to. You can't. There's not a lot of like weird cross streets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's suburbia. You know, I'm not gonna lie. It kind of sucks. It's like milk toast bullshit. But, you know, you can't get lost in my town. There's no way. You know.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I get it. I get it. Yes.
Hmm.
Well, we've been talking for a while. I did want to ask one more question about the record, though.
Yeah.
I look about at the cover, and it's
Hmm.
quite cryptic. There's parts of it that are bony. There's parts of it that are like a robot. There's a lot going on. Then you talk about you've as a band have talked about the themes of the record being a bit more abstract and
Yeah.
complex combined with all the sound going on, are you trying to challenge the listeners here? Is that kind of the intention, or is it just you're coming at it in a very abstract way?
Yeah. And I appreciate the question, both about the music and the art. You would sort of asked me like when we were like writing these songs, was there like some intention to be weird or different?
Yeah.
And like in general, like the answer to that is no. Like I'm not really trying to challenge the listener to do anything. I mean, me, I very simply like write this music, which I feel like I'm
Mm-hmm.
driven to do. And
Sure.
I'm lucky enough to do it with like three amazing people that also, if they don't share my exact vision, they're like willing to like come along for the ride and see like what happens, what takes place.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have as a collective any real intention to challenge the listener. Like I'm not writing music to be like, I hope the people listening can barely get through this song. Like I don't really, if anything, I'm like, no, I hope the people listen to this album like from beginning to end, and I hope they do it again. Like I hope it's not so challenging. I hope it's more interesting. I like
Yeah.
to write interesting music, and I think we are writing interesting music in our own way, you know. And it's not going to interest everybody, but it seems like it's interesting to a lot more people this time around than with the previous albums. So, and I like the word abstract only because there's no like solidified concept, you know, with what we're doing. We have like a lot of ideas musically, lyrically, even like artistically, visually. So we're not going to ever settle on, or at least we haven't yet, you know, one like, oh, this album is a concept album and it's about
Mm.
X. And each song is a journey from the beginning to the end. It's about X going through different things. Like that's just not what we're doing. We just have a lot of ideas. We have, I guess, a lot to say lyrically and musically, and we just want to like get it out, you know. If it's challenging to the listener at times, like that's just sort of a byproduct of the music we write, because death metal is challenging
Yeah.
at times. I mean, to me, death metal is challenging if I'm not in the mood for it. You
Sure.
know, if I don't want to listen to death metal, it's like challenging. And so I don't feel like I should force myself to listen to something that I'm not really fully engaged with. I don't know what I was. I put something on the other day, and I was like, I tried to almost force myself to listen to the whole album. Then I like halfway through, I'm like, I'm just not feeling this right now. And I don't want to move into a state of thinking this album sucks. I want to just say, I don't want to listen to this right now. And this album is still perfect for me. And I'm just going to turn it off and put something that fits my mood a little bit more succinctly, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is something I talked about with Tumo. We had kind of an extended conversation about the band Rush, and
Hmm.
the way you're talking about music, like wanting to, keep it interesting, but do something different. And to my mind, like Rush were the best at that. Like they were able to be quote unquote progressive and sometimes take kind of weird turns, but they had the listener in mind. It was fun, it was catchy, but also strange at times. And then
Yeah.
always like when bands can find that sweet spot, it can be incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, just speaking about Rush, like I'm not like the most well versed in Rush's discography. Like, I
Mm.
know some of the deep cuts. I know obviously like the radio hits and things like that, and some things
Yeah.
in between. Keith, the drummer, is much more of like a Rush fanatic.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. He could probably play as well as Neil could play drums. Uh, that being said, like I appreciate Rush so much,
Hmm.
because like you can't listen to Rush even casually and be like, oh, these guys aren't into this, and like they're so into it, and like
Yeah.
they're really into the music they write, they're really into the music they play, they're crafts people, and they do it with instruments, they do it with lyrics, they do it with vocals, and also visually to some extent with their album covers and live shows. um so I like that approach of just wanting to make like something it seems like they want to make a product that they're happy with.
Yeah.
Like, I hate to even call music a product, but I just want to write music that we're happy with, and I feel happy with what we're doing. Because I'm not bound by like a genre tag. I'm not
Hmm.
bound by trying to make things sound different. Like, people I've read or people have said, like, how do you put these things together? And I'm like, I don't even try. Like, we just like, this is
Yeah.
just what happens when four of us get together in the room, and the three of us, me, Dave, and Keith, who are like the musicians in the band. I'm not saying Will's not a musician, but I'm just separating the people that play an instrument from the vocalist in this particular part of the conversation.
Yeah.
We have a long history together, and I feel like when you have a relationship like that, even though like we're not always like best of friends, we're not always like hanging out, we have different lives, but when we get in like a jam space, like we're engaging on like a physical level, like together we're inhabiting like a space, but then like chemically something's happening too that I can't describe, but it works really well. Whatever we're doing, like I can present an idea, and Keith or Dave will bounce an idea back. And though there's a lot of discipline needed to practice, and there's a lot of challenge in just practicing regularly, um, the end result is something satisfying. And I always come away from practice feeling happier than when I did when I actually started practicing. Like a lot of times I don't want to go to practice because it's a lot of work to go to
Hmm.
practice. Like I have to drive, I have to like leave my family, I have to load up my car, I have to move equipment, I have to do so much just to go to practice. And it's almost enough to like not want to go, but I always go. And then whenever I leave and I'm driving home from practice, I'm like, that was a lot of fun. Even if we didn't have like a large amount of progress, we did make progress. And that's the thing that matters most. Like we get together consistently, and like we always write and we always practice, and it always is a good time.
Yeah.
Like I like these guys a lot. I love these guys, even though again we're not like the best of friends all the time. We don't really even hang out outside of the band, but like what we're doing feels like unique, and I don't have a relationship quite like this with other people. So it's like it's almost like a reason to live, being in Afterbirth, which I never would have thought this when I was starting this band, but if Afterbirth went away, and it will eventually, I will mourn, and but I'll move on. But it, you know, I'll find something else to replace it. It won't ever be the same, but I'll replace it with something else probably.
Well, sure, Afterbirth will end, but for right now, you're very much active, and so I got to ask: has the wheels and the brains been turning about what's next? Do you have kind of a kind of a near future plan for Afterbirth?
Yeah. Well, so we're already writing, like we already started like writing new stuff, you know.
Mhm.
Um, the song we're writing now, I'm like, it kind of feels like something that might have been on the first two records. It's not really as wildly experimental. It's more like this sort of, it's death metal with like a slight different edge, you know?
Sure.
And then I have other songs that are either just in my head that I want to present, and I have other songs that I've like worked on like in a demo fashion with
Hmm.
some very crude, you know, studio drums and stuff like that. Um, and again, you know, the material is pretty varied. I've got some songs that are just straight up like grindcore bangers, and I've got some songs that I have like a bunch of doom songs, and I'm like, I don't know, I don't know, like I haven't even like presented it to the band. I'm like, I don't know if this even is Afterbirth. This might be another project totally.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, we are thinking about the future. There's a couple of things in the works. You know, I'm already talking to Willowtip about another thing that might come out some point in 2024. I don't
Cool.
want to say too much about it. It's not a new album, but it's like a release
Yeah.
of some things, just to keep Afterbirth like on the lips and tongues of people that it matters to, while we, you know, sort of like go further down the rabbit hole. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't. I don't. I don't 100% know what's next, but things are happening.
Awesome. Well, with that said, I look forward to it. And to my viewers at home, if you have not heard the new Afterbirth album, In But Not Of, off of Willowtip Records, please go do that. You can find it on Bandcamp and all those places. Cody, before I let you go, is there anything else you wanted to get off your chest or any plugs you have?
Um, I don't really have anything to plug. You know, the album, the new.
Yeah.
You know, you just sort of plug the new album. I don't
Yeah.
need to do that again. Thank you. And it's actually nice just to talk about music in general and not just necessarily the band. You know,
Mhm.
I could like do this forever. You want to talk about Cannibal Corpse for another hour? Talk about Metallica for another hour? Like, you
Yeah.
know, that's awesome. I have like nothing else to say really. This I just enjoy talking to folks like you that are
Mm,
interested and reach out. I'm like a quiet introverted guy mostly, but you get me talking about the band
yeah.
and something that means so much to me, like I'll just blather on and on and on for days. You know, it seems
Yeah.
like. But this has been a nice conversation because we didn't just talk about the band. We talked about the mystery of music, which
Hell
is
yeah.
always like the bigger picture, you know.
Yeah.
Takes the spotlight off me a little bit too, because I don't really enjoy the spotlight so much.
Sure.
You know, I enjoy the output and like letting it be enjoyed by
Hmm.
other people. And then it's like, let me step back into the shadows and do the work, you know, necessary for something else. But that's it, really.
Yeah.
I appreciate you so much. So thanks.
Well, thank you. And I am so grateful that you agreed to come on the show. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I had a blast having the conversation. Hopefully, people at home enjoy it too. And
Mhm.
with that said, my name is Maddie, aka Beavermosh, and I am signing off.